Picture this. A 14-year-old girl enters a palace where women are ornaments, not operators. Where power is a man's birthright and a woman's ambition is a crime against nature itself. Fast forward 30 years. That same girl, she's sitting on the dragon throne, the most powerful seat in the world, the only woman in 4,000 years of Chinese history to rule an empire in her own name, not as a regent, not as a widow holding power for her son, but as emperor. Her name was Wu Zetian, and here's the thing they don't tell you in history class. She was brilliant, a political mastermind, a reformer who expanded China's borders and transformed its government. But the men who wrote the history books, they couldn't let that stand. So they turned her into a monster, a seductress, a murderer, a warning to every woman who dared to dream beyond her place. Today, we're tearing down 1,500 years of lies, because Wu Zetian's real story, it's not about a monster. It's about what happens when a woman refuses to disappear.
Wu Zetian was born in 624 CE, and right from the start, the world told her exactly what she was worth. Her father, Wu Zhihuo, was a timber merchant who'd made good, climbing into the lower ranks of aristocracy through wealth and strategic alliances. Not bad for a commoner family, but in Tang Dynasty China, this meant Wu Zetian's bloodline would always be questioned, always be seen as inferior. And being born female, that was the second strike against her before she could even walk. Let me paint you a picture of what it meant to be a woman in 7th century China. The philosophy that governed everything, Confucianism, had very specific ideas about where women belonged. There were the 3 obediences: obey your father before marriage, obey your husband after marriage, obey your son if widowed. Women existed to serve, to bear sons, to be seen, silent, and subservient. Education for women was limited to domestic skills, needlework, managing a household. The idea of a woman reading philosophy or discussing politics wasn't just unusual, it was dangerous. It disrupted the natural order. But Wu Zetian's father was different. He educated her. He taught her to read classical texts, to write with skill, to think critically. This wasn't common, and it would become her greatest weapon. When Wu Zetian was around 14 years old, she was selected to enter the palace of Emperor Taizong as a concubine. Now, to modern ears, that might sound like an honor, but let's be clear about what this actually meant. The imperial harem wasn't a romantic fantasy. It was a brutal hierarchy of hundreds of women competing for the attention of one man, because that attention meant survival. The emperor had one empress, then ranks upon ranks of consorts and concubines, each with a specific title, specific privileges, specific limitations. Most of these women would never even speak to the emperor. They'd live out their entire lives in gilded cages, invisible and forgotten. Wu Zetian entered as a 5th-rank concubine, one of the lowest positions. Her title was Kainyu, which translates roughly to talented one. The irony is almost painful. She had actual talent, actual intelligence, but in this system, those things didn't matter. What mattered was beauty, youth, and the ability to please a man. And here's where Wu Zetian's real education began, not in books, but in observation. She watched everything. She learned the invisible rules of palace politics, who had real power and who just appeared to, which eunuchs controlled access to the emperor, which consorts had family connections that protected them, which officials could be influenced, which ones were loyal to specific factions. The palace was a battleground, except the weapons were whispers, not swords. Rumors could destroy a woman's reputation overnight. A misplaced word could mean exile or worse. Women who threatened the wrong person simply disappeared, their deaths written off as illness or accident. Wu Zetian learned to navigate this maze. She kept her intelligence hidden when it needed to be hidden. She made herself useful to the right people. She studied Emperor Taizong, understanding not just what he wanted, but what he needed from the people around him. But here's the thing that nobody talks about. She was still just one woman among hundreds. Emperor Taizong liked her well enough, reportedly admiring her spirit and boldness. There's a famous story about how she volunteered to tame one of his wildest horses by suggesting she'd use 3 tools: a whip, a hammer, and a dagger. The message was clear. She wasn't afraid of a challenge, and she'd do whatever it took to succeed. But even with that boldness, Wu Zetian never became one of Taizong's favorites. She never bore him children. By the metrics that mattered in the palace, she was failing. And then, in 649 CE, Emperor Taizong died. For most concubines, this would be the end of the story. There was a tradition in China that when an emperor died, his concubines who hadn't borne sons were sent to Buddhist convents to live out their days as nuns. They had their heads shaved, put on plain robes, and disappeared from history. Wu Zetian was 25 years old, and according to every rule of her society, her life was over. Except she'd spent 11 years watching, learning, and planning. Because before Emperor Taizong died, something had happened, something that would change everything. Wu Zetian had met his son, Li Ji, the crown prince, who would become Emperor Gaozong. Some historical sources suggest they'd developed a relationship, perhaps even romantic, while Taizong was still alive. If true, this was absolutely forbidden. A concubine becoming involved with the emperor's son was one of the gravest taboos imaginable. But Wu Zetian understood something crucial. Rules were only strong as the people enforcing them, and if the right person wanted to break those rules, they could. So when she was sent to the convent, her head shaved, her future supposedly sealed, Wu Zetian didn't accept defeat. She waited, because she'd already planted the seeds of her return, and the new emperor, grieving his father and remembering the sharp-minded woman who'd caught his attention, would soon come looking for her. This is where Wu Zetian's story really begins. Not with power handed to her, but with power she'd have to seize from a system designed to crush her. And every single step forward would come at a cost. Here's what the history books won't tell you up front. Wu Zetian didn't claw her way back into the palace by being ruthless. She did it by being exactly what everyone expected her to be, until she wasn't. In 650 CE, barely a year after Emperor Taizong's death, Emperor Gaozong visited the convent where his father's former concubines were living out their forgotten lives. Officially, he was there to pay respects on the anniversary of his father's death, but everyone knew what he was really looking for. Wu Zetian, with her shaved head and nun's robes, wept when she saw him. The sources describe tears streaming down her face. And this is where things get interesting, because we have to ask ourselves, were those tears real, or was Wu Zetian giving a performance? The answer is probably both. That's what made her so dangerous. Within months, Emperor Gaozong brought Wu Zetian back to the palace, but here's the twist nobody saw coming. She didn't return as his concubine, not immediately. First, she was installed as a lady-in-waiting to Empress Wang, Gaozong's official wife. Let that sink in. Wu Zetian's path back to power went directly through the household of the woman who should have been her biggest obstacle. Empress Wang wasn't stupid. She knew exactly why she'd agreed to bring Wu Zetian into her inner circle. The empress had a problem. Consort Shao, another of the emperor's favorites, was gaining too much influence. Wang needed an ally, someone clever enough to distract the emperor from Shao, but controllable enough not to become a threat herself. Wu Zetian seemed perfect for the role. She was older now, nearly 30. She'd been out of the palace, out of practice. She'd be grateful for the opportunity. Empress Wang made the classic mistake of underestimating another woman. Wu Zetian did exactly what was expected. She charmed Emperor Gaozong. She rekindled whatever connection they'd had years before. She gave him something that Empress Wang, bound by rigid court protocol and the weight of her position, couldn't. Genuine conversation, intellectual sparring, a partnership that felt like more than duty. By 652, Wu Zetian had given birth to a son, then another, then a daughter. Everything changed with that daughter. In 654, Wu Zetian's infant daughter died. The circumstances were suspicious, and the timing was devastating. The baby died shortly after Empress Wang had visited and held her. Wu Zetian's grief was immediate and theatrical. She accused Wang of murdering her child out of jealousy. Did Empress Wang actually kill the baby? Almost certainly not. The historical evidence suggests something far darker, that Wu Zetian may have killed her own daughter to frame the empress. I know what you're thinking. That's the monster narrative we're supposed to be dismantling, right? But here's where we need to get uncomfortable, because the truth about Wu Zetian isn't that she was innocent of cruelty, it's that she was operating in a system where cruelty was the currency of survival. Think about it. Wu Zetian was a woman in her 30s in a palace where youth was valued above all else, competing with hundreds of other women for relevance. She had no family connections protecting her, no powerful allies. She'd already been exiled once. If she faded into obscurity again, that was it. Game over. So she made a choice, a horrific choice by any moral standard, but a rational one within the logic of palace politics. And it worked. Emperor Gaozong, grief-stricken and convinced of Wang's guilt, began the process of deposing her empress. This wasn't simple. The entire Confucian establishment opposed it. Ministers argued that removing an empress without proof of major crimes would destabilize the imperial house. Wang's family was powerful and well-connected. The precedent was dangerous. But Wu Zetian had something the ministers didn't: direct access to the emperor's ear, his bed, and increasingly his heart. She didn't argue politics with Gaozong. She didn't need to. Instead, she positioned herself as the solution to all his problems. She listened when he complained about stubborn ministers. She offered subtle suggestions that sounded like support, not manipulation. She made herself indispensable. By 655, Emperor Gaozong did the unthinkable. He deposed Empress Wang and demoted Consort Xiao. Both women were imprisoned in the palace, their titles stripped, their power evaporated overnight, and Wu Zetian became Empress of China. The Confucian scholars were apoplectic. This woman had no proper lineage. She'd been a concubine to the previous emperor, which made her relationship with his son technically incestuous by their standards. She manipulated her way into power using feminine wiles and political scheming. Everything about her elevation violated the natural order. They were right to be terrified, because Wu Zetian hadn't just broken into the boys' club. She was about to redesign the entire building. As empress, Wu Zetian faced immediate resistance from the old guard, particularly the powerful minister Zhangsan Wuji, who'd been one of Emperor Taizong's most trusted advisors. These men saw her as a temporary aberration, a woman the emperor would tire of once her novelty wore off. They didn't see what was really happening. Wu Zetian wasn't just influencing the emperor, she was studying governance. Emperor Gaozong suffered from chronic illnesses, likely including hypertension and possibly a form of epilepsy that caused dizzy spells and vision problems. These weren't minor inconveniences, they were debilitating conditions that made it difficult for him to handle the daily business of running an empire. So Wu Zetian started attending state meetings with him. At first, she sat behind a screen, invisible but present, listening to everything. When Gaozong struggled to make decisions or needed to rest, she'd quietly offer her thoughts. Ministers started noticing that imperial edicts began reflecting her perspectives. The traditional power brokers tried to push back. They appealed to Confucian tradition, arguing that a woman's presence in government was inappropriate. They whispered that the emperor was weak, controlled by his wife. Wu Zetian responded by removing them. Not all at once, not dramatically, but one by one, officials who opposed her found themselves reassigned to distant provinces, demoted or accused of corruption. She built a network of loyal supporters, promoting men who owed their positions to her rather than to aristocratic family connections. And here's the brilliant part. She did it using Confucian language. She argued for meritocracy, for selecting officials based on talent, not birth. She emphasized efficiency and loyalty to the emperor above factional interests. She wrapped revolutionary change in the clothing of traditional values. By the 660s, something unprecedented was happening. Wu Zetian wasn't just influencing the emperor, she was functionally co-ruling China alongside her husband. documents from this period show both their names on official decrees. She held her own audiences with officials. She made policy decisions. The empire was being run by a woman, and she was doing it so skillfully that by the time everyone realized what had happened, it was too late to stop her. But Wu Zetian understood something crucial. She needed legitimacy beyond just her husband's favor. She needed to change the narrative about what women could be. So she started promoting Baektis texts that emphasized the equality of souls, male and female. She commissioned interpretations of scriptures that prophesied a female ruler would bring a golden age to China. She positioned herself not as an aberration, but as a fulfillment of destiny. The Confucian scholars hated this. Buddhism and Confucianism had always competed for influence in Chinese society, and Wu Zetian was deliberately empowering Buddhism to undercut Confucian arguments about gender hierarchy. It was ideological warfare, and she was winning. When Emperor Gaozong's health deteriorated further in the 670s, Wu Zetian stepped even more openly into leadership. She didn't ask for permission, she didn't apologize, she simply governed, and she governed well enough that even her critics had to admit the empire was stable, prosperous, and expanding. By the time Gaozong died in 683, Wu Zetian had been the real power in China for nearly 20 years. And she was just getting started. Because now she faced the ultimate question. Could she hold power without a husband? Could a woman rule an empire not through a man, but as herself? The answer would shock everyone, including the woman who'd spent her entire life preparing for this moment.
When Emperor Gaozong died in 683, Wu Zetian was 59 years old. In a world where women were considered past their prime by 30, where age was supposed to make her irrelevant, she was about to do something no woman had ever done. But first, she had to pretend she wasn't. Her son, Li Zhe, became Emperor Zongzong. On paper, Wu Zetian stepped back into the traditional role of Empress Dowager, the emperor's mother. Respectable, expected, safe. It lasted 6 weeks. Emperor Zongzong made one critical mistake. He tried to actually rule. He wanted to promote his wife's father to an important position, a routine act of imperial favor, except Wu Zetian had spent decades building a government structure that ran on merit and loyalty to her, not family connections and aristocratic privilege. When her advisors objected to Zongzong's appointment, he reportedly said, "What's wrong with me giving the entire empire to my father-in-law if I want to?" Wu Zetian heard about this, and she deposed her own son. Let me say that again. She removed the emperor from power, her own child, after 6 weeks. This wasn't a grief-stricken mother protecting a weak son. This was a political operator who'd spent 40 years building something, and she wasn't about to watch it collapse because of nepotism and incompetence. She replaced Zongzong with her younger son, Li Dan, who became Emperor Rizong. But everyone understood the reality. Rizong is emperor in name only. Wu Zetian held court from behind a screen, made all major decisions, and ran the empire exactly as she had been doing for years. Except now, something started to shift. Wu Zetian began to wonder, why was she still pretending? In 690, at the age of 65, Wu Zetian did something that had never been done in Chinese history. She declared herself emperor, not empress, not regent, not dowager, emperor. She changed the name of the dynasty from Tang to Zhou. She took the imperial title Shangshen Hongdi, Holy and Divine Emperor. She sat on the dragon throne in her own right, wearing the imperial robes, conducting state business under her own name. The entire Confucian establishment should have risen in revolt, and some did try. But here's what nobody expected. Most of the empire just kept functioning. Because Wu Zetian had been running China for so long that her official coronation as emperor was almost a formality. And then she started to prove why she'd been so dangerous to the old order all along. Wu Zetian expanded the imperial examination system in ways that fundamentally changed who could access power in China.
For centuries, government positions had gone primarily to men from aristocratic families, the same clans recycling power generation after generation. The exam system existed, but it was limited and family connections still mattered more than talent. Wu Zetian changed that. She created new categories of examinations. She opened them to a broader range of candidates. Most importantly, she actually promoted people who passed regardless of whether their great-grandfather had been a duke. This wasn't kindness, it was strategy. Every official who owed his position to merit rather than birth was an official who owed his loyalty to the emperor who'd promoted him, to her. She created a whole new class of bureaucrats who had no reason to support the old aristocratic order because that order had kept them powerless. But here's where it gets really interesting. Wu Zetian didn't just promote more people, she promoted different kinds of people. Officials who came from merchant families, from the provinces, from backgrounds that would have been automatically excluded before. She created one of the most diverse governments in Chinese history. Was this because she believed in equality? Maybe partly, but it was also because she understood something the old guard didn't. Talent doesn't care about bloodlines, and if you want to run an empire efficiently, you need the smartest people you can find, not just the ones with the right last names. The results were undeniable. During Wu Zetian's reign, China's borders expanded. She launched successful military campaigns against the Tibetan Empire and the Korean kingdoms. She didn't lead armies herself, obviously, but she selected generals based on their records, not their family connections, and it showed. The economy stabilized. Agricultural production increased. Infrastructure projects connected distant parts of the empire. Trade flourished along the Silk Road. She was really good at this. And that might be the most threatening thing about her, because if Wu Zetian had been a disaster as emperor, if her reign was chaos and decline, the Confucian scholars could have pointed to her as proof that women couldn't rule, the natural order vindicated. Instead, she was proving that gender had nothing to do with governing ability. Wu Zetian also did something that gets overlooked in discussions of her rule. She invested heavily in education and culture. She established new schools. She patronized poets and artists. She commissioned massive Buddhist construction projects, including the famous Longmen grottos. Why Buddhism? Partly because she genuinely seems to have been devout, but also because Buddhism gave her ideological ammunition against Confucianism. Buddhist texts emphasized spiritual equality, the ability of any soul to achieve enlightenment regardless of gender. Some scriptures even prophesied that a female Chakravartin, a righteous wheel-turning monarch, would bring a golden age. Wu Zetian made sure those texts were widely distributed. She commissioned new translations that emphasized these themes. She built temples and supported monasteries that taught these interpretations. This was propaganda, yes, but it was also genuinely transformative. For the first time, there was a mainstream ideological framework in China that didn't automatically place women beneath men in cosmic hierarchy. The Confucian establishment fought back through the only weapon they had left, writing. They couldn't remove her from power, the empire wouldn't support it. They couldn't prove she was incompetent because she wasn't, so they focused on her character. Stories started circulating about her personal life, her relationships, her sexuality. The implication was clear. Even if she could govern, she was morally corrupt, driven by base desires rather than virtuous principles. This is where we start to see the seeds of her later demonization. Because the ministers couldn't beat her policies, they attacked her as a woman. But here's what's fascinating. Wu Zetian didn't hide. She didn't try to appear more traditionally feminine to appease her critics. In fact, she did the opposite. She created an official position called the Kaifu system, essentially male favorites who held ceremonial roles in the palace. The historical sources make a huge deal about this, painting Wu Zetian as a lustful old woman surrounding herself with young men. But think about what male emperors have been doing for thousands of years. Imperial harems with hundreds of concubines. Nobody questioned that. It was normal. Wu Zetian was doing the same thing, but reversed. And suddenly, it was scandalous. Was she making a point? Absolutely. She was demonstrating that she had the same imperial prerogatives as any male emperor, including the right to her own personal life. The double standard was obvious, and she refused to pretend it didn't exist. By the early 700s, Wu Zetian was in her 70s and still governing actively. The empire was stable, prosperous, and well-administered. She'd proven beyond any doubt that a woman could rule China as effectively as any man. But age was catching up to her, and the forces that had always opposed her were waiting for their moment. In 705, when Wu Zetian fell seriously ill, a group of ministers staged a coup. They forced her to abdicate in favor of her son, Zongzong, the same son she'd deposed 20 years earlier. Wu Zetian died later that year, at age 81. And then the real work of destroying her began, because the men who came after her understood something crucial. They couldn't erase what she'd accomplished. China had been so successful, stable under her rule. So, instead, they had to change the story. They had to transform her from a capable emperor into a cautionary tale. They had to make her a monster. And that rewriting of history, that's where things get really ugly.
Here's something that should make you furious. The men who wrote Wu Zetian's history weren't historians. They were propagandists with a very specific agenda. And they were terrifyingly good at their job. The primary source for Wu Zetian's life is a text called the Old Book of Tang, compiled in 945 CE, more than 2 centuries after her death. Think about that. 200 years of stories being passed down, embellished, twisted to serve the purposes of whoever was in power. And who was in power? The Tang dynasty, the very dynasty Wu Zetian had temporarily replaced. They had every reason to make her look illegitimate. But here's where it gets insidious. The historians didn't just lie, they did something much more sophisticated. They took real events and reframed them through the lens of her gender, turning political decisions into evidence of feminine hysteria, strategic moves into proof of sexual manipulation. Let me show you how this worked. Wu Zetian did have people executed. That's historical fact. She purged officials who opposed her, eliminated rivals, dealt harshly with those she perceived as threats. The historical records mention specific individuals who were killed on her orders. But here's what those same records conveniently forget to mention. Emperor Taizong, her first husband, the man celebrated as one of China's greatest emperors, he killed his own brothers to secure the throne. He executed hundreds of people during his reign. This was considered strong leadership. Emperor Taizong's father, the founder of the Tang dynasty, he built his empire on the corpses of rivals. Heroic. Literally every emperor in Chinese history had blood on their hands. Political purges was standard practice. Eliminating threats was governing 101. But when Wu Zetian did it, suddenly it became evidence of her unnatural cruelty, her feminine vindictiveness, her monstrous nature. The historical texts describe her methods of execution in graphic, almost pornographic detail. They claim she invented new tortures, that she enjoyed watching people suffer, that she laughed while her enemies died. Do we have actual evidence for any of this? No, we have stories written by her enemies decades after her death, designed to make her sound like a sadistic psychopath. Compare this to how male emperors' violence was recorded. Clean, factual. Emperor so-and-so ordered the execution of X number of rebels. No lingering descriptions of their cruelty. No suggestions that they took personal pleasure in violence. The double standard is so blatant it's almost comical. Except it worked. For 1,000 years, it worked. Let's talk about the story that really cemented Wu Zetian's reputation as a monster, what she allegedly did to Empress Wang and consort Shao after they were deposed. According to the historical accounts, Wu Zetian had both women beaten, their hands and feet cut off, and then threw them into wine vats to drown. The texts claim that as they were dying, Consort Shao cursed Wu Zetian, saying she hoped to be reborn as a cat so she could tear out Wu Zetian's throat, and that Wu Zetian was so terrified of this curse that she banned cats from the palace for the rest of her life. It's a horrifying story, vivid, memorable, the kind of detail that sticks in people's minds. It's also probably not true. The earliest sources about Wu Zetian's reign don't mention this incident. It appears in texts written much later, when the Tang dynasty was trying to re-establish its legitimacy by demonizing the woman who'd interrupted their rule. But let's say it did happen. Let's say Wu Zetian really did order a brutal execution of her rivals. We need to ask, why does this story get told so differently than similar stories about male rulers? When Emperor Taizong killed his brothers, the historical texts frame it as tragic necessity. When male emperors ordered executions, it was justice, strategic, regrettable but necessary. When Wu Zetian allegedly did it, it became proof of feminine evil, jealousy, vindictiveness, the natural result of giving power to a woman. See how that works? The action is the same, the interpretation is completely different. Now let's talk about the sexual politics, because this is where the character assassination gets really ugly. The historical texts are obsessed with Wu Zetian's sexuality in a way they never are with male emperors. They describe in detail her relationships with various men, particularly in her later years. They claim she kept male favorites, young men who had no purpose except to satisfy her desires. The most famous of these alleged lovers were the Zhang brothers, who held positions in her government during her final years. The historical texts paint them as pretty boy opportunists who seduced an elderly woman to gain power. Here's what's fascinating. Even if this was true, so what? Male emperors had concubines their entire lives, multiple women, hundreds of women. This was completely normal, expected, a sign of virility and power. But Wu Zetian, a woman in her 70s, allegedly having relationships with men, scandalous, unnatural, proof of her moral corruption. The language used to describe her sexuality is telling. Male emperors take concubines. Wu Zetian is lustful, debauched, insatiable. Male emperors are virile. Wu Zetian is perverted. And here's the really insidious part. By focusing on her sexuality, the historical texts distract from her actual governance. They reduce her 40-year political career to the story of a woman who slept her way to power and then couldn't control her base desires. It's character assassination disguised as history. But the propaganda went deeper than individual stories. The historians rewrote the entire framework of her reign. Remember how Wu Zetian changed the dynasty name from Tang to Zhou? How she officially declared herself emperor? The historical texts frame this as illegitimate usurpation. They refuse to recognize her Zhou dynasty as real. In the official chronology of Chinese history, the Tang dynasty has a brief interruption, not a replacement. They literally erased her dynasty from legitimacy. And they did this by leaning heavily on Confucian concepts of cosmic order. The argument went like this: a woman ruling violates the natural hierarchy of heaven and earth. Therefore, her rule cannot be legitimate, no matter how successful it was. Her reign was an aberration, a mistake in the cosmic order that needed to be corrected. This wasn't just political, it was ideological warfare, designed to ensure that Wu Zetian could never be used as precedent for future female rulers. Think about how brilliant and horrifying this is. They couldn't deny that she'd ruled successfully. The empire had been too prosperous, too stable. Too many people alive during her reign could testify to her competence. So instead, they argued that success didn't matter, that competence was irrelevant, that a woman ruling was fundamentally wrong regardless of results. It was gaslighting on a civilizational scale. The texts also created what we might call the seductress narrative. They portrayed young Wu Zetian as using her beauty and sexual wiles to manipulate weak-willed emperors. This served two purposes. It made her success about her body, not her mind, and it made the emperors who elevated her look like victims of feminine manipulation rather than willing participants. Emperor Taizong, in these accounts, becomes a tragic figure, a good man corrupted by a scheming woman. Never mind that Emperor Taizong actively chose to bring Wu Zetian back into the palace. Never mind that he consistently supported her political decisions for decades. The narrative required him to be a victim, so that's what he became. This pattern shows up everywhere in how historical women with power are portrayed. Cleopatra, seductress who manipulated Roman generals. Catherine the Great, sexually voracious woman who corrupted Russia. Elizabeth Bathory, blood-drinking sadist. Notice the pattern? When women have power, histories written by men transform them into monsters defined by their sexuality and cruelty. Their intelligence gets reframed as manipulation, their strength becomes unnatural, their sexuality becomes deviance. Wu Zetian got the full treatment. And here's what should really enrage you. This propaganda worked so well that it lasted for 1,000 years. For 1,000 years, Wu Zetian was remembered primarily as a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when women step outside their proper roles. Chinese folklore developed stories about her. Operas portrayed her as a villain. She became the archetypal evil empress, the woman whose ambition brought chaos. Except, again, her reign wasn't chaotic. It was stable and prosperous. But facts don't matter when you're creating mythology. The most damning thing about this historical rewriting is what it prevented. For over 1,000 years after Wu Zetian, no other woman ruled China. As emperor, not one. She was the only woman in 4 millennia of Chinese imperial.
Let's talk about the question everyone avoids. Was Wu Zetian a good person? Wrong question. Here's the better question. In a system designed to destroy her, what would you have done? Because that's what we're really asking when we judge Wu Zetian's actions. We're asking whether survival justifies brutality, whether self-preservation excuses ruthlessness, whether the ends can ever justify the means. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Wu Zetian probably did kill people who didn't deserve to die. She probably destroyed families to consolidate power. She likely made decisions that were morally indefensible by any standard. But before we condemn her, let's run a thought experiment. You're a 30-year-old woman in 7th century China. You've just been sent to a Buddhist convent, your head shaved, your future erased. You know that back in the palace, hundreds of other women are competing for relevance. You know that if you fade into obscurity, you'll spend the next 40 years forgotten, irrelevant, effectively dead. You get one chance to come back, one opportunity to reclaim a life. What do? Do you play it safe? Do you be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you can get? Do you accept that your role is to serve, to be quiet, to disappear gracefully? Or do you fight? And if you fight, how far are you willing to go? Because here's what the moral philosophers don't tell you. Systems don't change because people ask nicely. Power doesn't redistribute itself because someone makes a compelling argument for fairness. Wu Zetian understood something that most of us never have to face. In a zero-sum game where your loss is someone else's gain, compassion can be suicide. Let's go back to that dead baby, Wu Zetian's infant daughter who died under suspicious circumstances right after Empress Wang visited, the incident that destroyed Wang and elevated Wu Zetian. Did Wu Zetian kill her own child? Honestly, we'll never know for certain. The sources that claim she did were written by her enemies. But let's say she did. Let's sit with that horror for a moment. A mother killing her own infant daughter to frame a political rival.
It's monstrous, unforgivable, the kind of act that should disqualify someone from any moral consideration. Except here's what keeps me up at night. What if that was the only move available? Think about Wu Zetian's position at that moment. She was back in the palace, yes, but her status was precarious. She had no family backing, no powerful allies. Empress Wang and Consort Shao had real institutional support. If they decided Wu Zetian was a threat, they could have her eliminated, quietly, permanently. And nobody would care, because Wu Zetian was replaceable. There were hundreds of women in that palace. What was one more? So she made a calculation, a horrifying calculation. One child's life versus her own survival, and possibly the survival of her sons, because if Wu Zetian fell, her children would have been vulnerable too. I'm not saying it was right. I'm saying it was rational within a system that valued women only as tools for men's ambitions. And that's what makes this so disturbing. Because Wu Zetian's brutality wasn't random sadism. It was strategic, cold, calculated. She was playing the same game male emperors had been playing for thousands of years. She was just playing it from a position of much greater vulnerability. Let's look at another example, the purges. Wu Zetian absolutely eliminated political opponents. The historical records, even accounting for exaggeration, confirm that she removed people from power, sometimes violently. Members of the old aristocracy, officials who opposed her reforms, people who questioned her legitimacy. But here's what's interesting. Most of the people she purged were the same people who would have purged her if they'd had the chance. The Confucian ministers who opposed her weren't just disagreeing with policy. They fundamentally believed she had no right to exist in political space. They wrote treatises arguing that her very presence in government violated cosmic law. These weren't people who could be won over with compromise. They wanted her gone, not just out of power, but erased from significance entirely. So what was Wu Zetian supposed to do? Have a philosophical debate with people who believed her gender made her subhuman? Wait for them to see reason. She eliminated them before they could eliminate her. Is that moral? By our standards, probably not. But by the standards of Tang Dynasty politics, it was standard operating procedure. Every single emperor before and after Wu Zetian did the same thing. They purged rivals, they eliminated threats, they consolidated power through violence. The difference is that when men did it, history called it statecraft. When Wu Zetian did it, history called it cruelty. Here's where it gets morally complicated. Wu Zetian wasn't just fighting for herself. Whether she intended it or not, she was fighting for the possibility of female power. If she had failed, if she had been destroyed by the system, the message would have been clear. Women who reach for power will be crushed. The natural order will reassert itself. Know your place. But because she succeeded, because she ruled for decades and proved that a woman could govern effectively, she created a crack in the ideological wall, a proof of concept. Not that it mattered in the short term. As we discussed, China didn't have another female emperor for over 1,000 years. But the example existed. The possibility had been demonstrated. Does that justify her actions? Does the symbolic importance of her success excuse the people she hurt? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. But I do know this. We don't ask these questions about male rulers. We don't agonize over whether Julius Caesar's ambition justified the Roman civil wars. We don't wring our hands about whether Napoleon's military genius excuses his imperialism. We accept that powerful men throughout history did terrible things, and we evaluate them on the totality of their achievements, military victories, administrative reforms, cultural contributions. But when a woman does terrible things in pursuit of power, we reduce her to those terrible things. We make her moral character the entire story. Why is that? Here's my theory. Because the system is designed to make women's power feel illegitimate, and one way to maintain that illegitimacy is to hold women to moral standards we never apply to men. A male emperor eliminates rivals, strategic necessity. A female emperor eliminates rivals, monstrous cruelty. A male emperor has multiple sexual partners, normal imperial privilege. A female emperor has multiple sexual partners, depraved perversion. A male emperor prioritizes power over family, strong leadership. A female emperor prioritizes power over family, unnatural wickedness. The actions are the same, the judgment is completely different. And that double standard serves a purpose. It ensures that women who seek power will always be suspect, always be questioned, always be held to impossible standards. Because if we acknowledge that Wu Zetian was simply doing what powerful people do, consolidating power, eliminating threats, making harsh decisions for strategic reasons, then we have to acknowledge that gender has nothing to do with ruling ability. And that's the one thing the patriarchal system cannot afford to admit. So instead, we get the morality play, the cautionary tale, the woman who reached too high and revealed her monstrous nature. But what if Wu Zetian's real crime wasn't cruelty? What if the thing that made her truly dangerous was that she was effective, that she proved a woman could do everything a man could do, often better? That's the threat the system needed to neutralize, not the violence, the success. Because violence from rulers was normal, expected, but success from a woman? That was revolutionary. That was dangerous. So they buried her success under stories of her cruelty. They made her brutality the story, so her competence couldn't be. And for 1,000 years, it worked. But here's what they couldn't erase: the empire itself, the roads she built, the officials she promoted, the systems she reformed, the prosperity she created. You can rewrite a person's character. You can turn a politician into a monster in the historical record. But you can't erase 40 years of effective governance. You can't undo an empire that functioned, that thrived, that expanded under her rule. The evidence of Wu Zetian's competence is literally carved into China's landscape. The temples she built, the examinations she expanded, the trade routes she secured. Those don't lie. Those can't be reinterpreted as feminine wickedness. And that's why eventually the truth started to emerge. Because you can only maintain a lie for so long before the physical evidence contradicts it. Wu Zetian was brutal, she was ruthless, she made decisions that cost innocent people's lives. She was also brilliant, strategic, effective. Both things can be true, both things are true. The question isn't whether we can forgive her, the question is whether we're willing to judge her by the same standards we apply to every other ruler in history. And if we're not, we need to ask ourselves why.
In 1963, something strange happened in China. Archaeologists were excavating Tang Dynasty sites when they discovered something that had been buried for over 1,200 years. Official documents, seals, administrative records from Wu Zetian's reign. And they told a completely different story than the history books. The documents showed meticulous governance, detailed economic planning, sophisticated administrative systems, evidence of infrastructure projects, educational reforms, strategic military planning. This wasn't the paperwork of a monster. This was the bureaucracy of a highly competent government. Historians started asking uncomfortable questions. If Wu Zetian's reign had been the chaotic nightmare the traditional sources described, how had the empire not only survived but thrived? How had these systems functioned so efficiently? The answer was becoming unavoidable. Maybe the traditional sources had been lying. But here's what's fascinating. This wasn't just happening in China. Around the world in the 1960s and 70s, historians were starting to re-examine historical women who'd been dismissed as villains or footnotes. Feminist scholars began applying new analytical frameworks. They started asking, whose perspective are these histories written from? Who benefits from these narratives? What evidence are we ignoring? And when they turned that lens on Wu Zetian, the monster mask started to crack. One of the first major reassessments came from historian R.W.L. Guizot in the 1970s. He did something revolutionary. He compared Wu Zetian's actions directly to her male contemporaries and predecessors. The results were striking. The political purges everyone cited as evidence of her cruelty, smaller in scale than Emperor Taizong's. Her alleged sexual impropriety, modest compared to the harems maintained by virtually every emperor. When you actually compared the evidence instead of just accepting the narrative, Wu Zetian looked less like a uniquely terrible ruler and more like a fairly standard emperor who happened to be female. But the reassessment went deeper than just defending her against accusations. Scholars started recognizing things about Wu Zetian's reign that had been deliberately overlooked. The examination system she expanded, it fundamentally changed Chinese governance. For the next 1,000 years, until the end of the imperial system, China selected officials primarily through merit-based examinations. That legacy traces directly back to Wu Zetian's reforms. She didn't just use the system for her own political advantage, she institutionalized it. She made meritocracy a permanent feature of Chinese government. Think about how radical that was. In a society built on hereditary privilege, where your birth determined your destiny, Wu Zetian created pathways for talent to bypass bloodlines. Was this because she believed in equality? Probably not in the way we'd understand it, but she understood that aristocratic nepotism was inefficient, that promoting capable people regardless of background made for better governance. And she was right. The administrative innovations she implemented lasted for centuries. Modern economic historians have also reassessed her reign's prosperity. During Wu Zetian's rule, agricultural production increased, tax revenues grew, trade expanded, infrastructure projects connected remote regions. These aren't the achievements of a chaotic tyrant. These are the results of strategic economic planning. Dr. Lily Xiaohong Li, a prominent scholar of Chinese women's history, pointed out something crucial. Wu Zetian's reign represents one of the most stable periods in Tang Dynasty history. No major rebellions, no civil wars, no dynastic collapse. For a reign that was supposedly illegitimate and chaotic, it was remarkably peaceful. But here's where the modern reassessment gets really interesting. Scholars started looking at Wu Zetian not just as a historical figure, but as a lens for understanding how history itself gets written. Because Wu Zetian's demonization wasn't an accident. It wasn't just bias. It was a deliberate propaganda campaign with specific political goals. The Tang Dynasty needed to delegitimize her to re-establish their own legitimacy. Confucian scholars needed to make her an example to prevent future women from attempting the same thing. Male elites needed to transform her success into a cautionary tale. So they rewrote her. They took a complex, capable politician and turned her into a one-dimensional monster. And in doing so, they revealed exactly how history gets weaponized against women in power. Professor N. Harry Rothschild wrote an entire book analyzing Wu Zetian's religious and political propaganda. What he found was fascinating. Wu Zetian was a sophisticated image maker who understood how to use ideology to justify her position. She didn't just grab power and hope people accepted it. She built an entire intellectual and religious framework to support female rule. She commissioned texts, she patronized scholars, she created narratives. This wasn't deception, this was statecraft. Every ruler does this. Every government creates legitimizing narratives. But when male emperors did it, it was called building a mandate. When Wu Zetian did it, it was called manipulation. The double standard, once you start seeing it, is everywhere. Here's something that might surprise you. Wu Zetian is actually having a cultural renaissance in modern China. TV dramas portray her as a complex, intelligent character rather than a villain. Historical novels explore her perspective. Academic conferences reassess her contributions. In 2019, a major Chinese historical drama called The Empress of China presented Wu Zetian as a tragic hero, a brilliant woman constrained by patriarchal systems. It was massively popular. Why now? Why is Wu Zetian being reclaimed after centuries of demonization? Partly, it's better historical scholarship. We have more evidence, more sophisticated analytical tools, more willingness to question traditional narratives. But it's also cultural. As conversations about gender equality evolve, Wu Zetian becomes relevant in new ways. She's not just a historical curiosity, she's a mirror for examining how we treat powerful women today. Think about it. The tactics used to undermine Wu Zetian, questioning her sexuality, exaggerating her cruelty, denying her competence, framing her ambition as unnatural, these are still used against women in power. Female politicians face constant scrutiny about their appearance, their relationships, their likability. Their anger is shrillness, their confidence is arrogance, their ambition is ruthlessness. Male politicians displaying identical traits, strong, decisive, leadership material. Wu Zetian's story isn't ancient history, it's a template that's still being used. But here's where we need to be careful, because in the rush to reclaim Wu Zetian, there's a temptation to overcorrect, to make her a perfect feminist icon, to erase the uncomfortable parts of her story. That would be a mistake. Wu Zetian's power came at a cost. Real people were hurt. Real families were destroyed. Her path to the throne was paved with manipulation, violence, and political ruthlessness. We don't honor her legacy by pretending she was a saint. We honor it by acknowledging the full complexity of her choices. She was a woman operating in a system designed to destroy her, and she survived by becoming better at the system's own game than the men who'd created it. That required brutality. It required moral compromises. It required decisions most of us will never have to make. The question isn't whether she was good or bad. The question is what her story teaches us. And here's what I think it teaches us. The cost of power is always high, but for women, that cost is astronomical. Because men can be ruthless and still be respected. They can eliminate rivals and be called strategic. They can prioritize power over family and be called dedicated. Women doing identical things are called monsters. Wu Zetian knew this. She had to have known this. She spent her entire life watching how the rules applied differently to her than to the men around her. And she decided to play anyway, not because she thought it was fair, but because the alternative was invisibility. Modern scholars are also recognizing Wu Zetian's cultural impact beyond just governance. The Buddhist art she patronized, the Longmen grots, are UNESCO World Heritage Sites. The literary culture that flourished during her reign influenced Chinese poetry for generations. She created space for female scholars and poets in ways that hadn't existed before. Women like Shang Guanwaner, a brilliant poet and official who served in Wu Zetian's court, would have been unthinkable without Wu Zetian's example. Was this intentional mentorship? Maybe. Or maybe it was just that once a woman held power, it became slightly less unthinkable for other women to be taken seriously. Either way, the impact was real. But here's what really gets me about Wu Zetian's legacy. She almost succeeded in changing everything. Think about it. She ruled for 40-plus years. She proved beyond any doubt that a woman could govern as effectively as a man. She created systems and precedents. And then she died, and the old order snapped back into place like nothing had happened. For over 1,000 years, no other woman ruled China. Wu Zetian became an anomaly, an aberration, a cautionary tale.